If you live in the United States, news about chaos at the US-Mexico border is frequent. Trouble there is not new, however. Concern about it has existed before it was even established, as movement between Mexico and the United States has always presented opportunities, but not always in the ways you might think. To see why, join me for this brief look at the history of the US-Mexico border. The original boundary between the two countries was first established in 1819 under the Adams-Onis Treaty between Spain and the United States, what would later become the Texas-Louisiana and Oklahoma borders. Mexico inherited it when it became independent in 1821, along with concerns about American expansionism. Mexico's strategy to defuse the problem was to offer potential American migrants land and Mexican citizenship, which they took up gladly. This backfired, however, largely because the newcomers refused to abide by one of the most important Mexican laws, the abolition of slavery. As Mexico was too far to take seriously the complaints of the newcomers or to impose its will, the conflict grew, paving the way for an independent Republic of Texas in 1836. Beset by problems, however, it barely lasted a decade and was quickly annexed to the United States. That might have been the end of it, except that there was one other problem, a border dispute between Texas and Mexico, which then became a row between Mexico and the United States. The root of that conflict was that Texas claimed a much larger territory than it had had as a Mexican province. So while Texas saw its border as ending at the Rio Grande, the Mexican government considered the boundary to be the Nueces River and sent troops there to secure it, as did the U.S. This eventually led to a skirmish where American soldiers were killed, which in turn led to the US-Mexico War. The fighting was a complete disaster for Mexico. An American invasion occupied their capital city and forced them to give up half their territory, as stipulated in the Treaty of Guadalupe, Hidalgo in 1848. It could have been even worse. There were several efforts to gain even more land. One wanted all of Mexico annexed, and another wanted the border to be hundreds of miles further south, gaining another third of present-day Mexico. In the end, that did not happen, mostly because in addition to northern opposition, who saw its territory fertile for the creation of slave states, there were also people who did not want to deal with the massive non-white population that would have become part of the United States, namely John C. Calhoun, a South Carolina senator who led the opposition. So the U.S. kept the sparsely populated northern half, and a few years later, in 1853, bought a smaller area, the Gadsden Purchase. This was mostly because the United States wanted to build a southern transcontinental railroad, and the Gadsden acquisition had flatter land conducive to it. The U.S. paid $10 million for it, only $5 million less than it had paid for the previous Mexican cession, so it ended up being a much better deal for the Mexican government. As part of the treaty, Mexican citizens were granted American citizenship, and in theory, the U.S. agreed to respect all of their rights. Still, this was not what happened in practice, especially because the 1849 gold rush in California encouraged the dispossession of property of Mexican Americans, whether those that found gold or had property that might. And of course, because Mexicans were seen as inferior, and it was the Americans' duty to civilize the barbarian territories. Still, that process took decades. In the meantime, by 1853, the US-Mexico border ended up within the geographical boundaries it has today. In those early decades, the border was divided into two very different sections. The western side, which began in the San Diego area and ended somewhere near El Paso, Texas, and the eastern side, which began there and followed along the Rio Grande all the way to Brownsville in the Gulf of Mexico. Given that there were no natural barriers on the western side, for the most part, the border remained an imaginary line well into the 20th century. The eastern side was different. The river provided a clear boundary which people began to use for their own purposes. On the one hand, there were enslaved people who managed to escape the nearby Texas and Louisiana plantations and found refuge in Mexico, which by the 1850s was staunchly abolitionist. On the other, there were different indigenous groups who used the international boundary strategically to raid farms or towns. Of course, neither Mexico, the United States, or the indigenous groups recognized each other, so the natives simply used the two countries' own rules against them, crossing the invisible line to hide from the other. Once the boundary became better demarcated on the western side, natives would use similar tactics, most famously by Geronimo, an Apache man who would become a symbol of indigenous resistance. These raids became a huge issue and paved the way for the first sustained levels of cooperation between Mexico and the United States. In fact, when Geronimo was captured one last time in 1886, it happened on the Mexican side of the border. Later, outlaws and smugglers would do something similar, as they too tried to take advantage of the international boundary. The groups just mentioned notwithstanding, in the early decades the border was not seen by either country as one meant to keep people out, but rather as a place that neighbors shared. There were no walls or much border control even in urban areas. That is why single towns developed that were artificially divided by an imaginary line that could easily be crossed. That was especially the case in the West, where no river existed, such as in Nogales or Calexico. This all began to change with the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, a law passed by the U.S. Congress that banned the immigration of all Chinese and Japanese people to the country. Problem was that at the exact same time the Chinese ban came into effect, Mexico was actively encouraging Chinese immigration because of labor shortages in the Mexican economy. That meant in practice that somewhere around 80% of Chinese immigrants that came to Mexico opted to then go north. This encouraged Americans to place controls on the US-Mexico border, but the international boundary was so massive that the efforts were not particularly effective. It's estimated that somewhere around 17,000 Chinese managed to cross, although some did die trying to cross the desert, echoing the current crisis. This, of course, greatly frustrated those who supported the act and insisted a wall should be built to keep the Chinese out. Sound familiar? As the border began to harden, it still remained pretty open to Mexican nationals. This was the case more or less until 1910, when the Mexican Revolution began. At that point, the United States started to receive both refugees from the war and people who wanted to take advantage of the international boundary to further their political ambitions. Indeed, the success of the person who began the Mexican Revolution, Francisco Madero, was largely due to the fact that he began his revolution on the other side of the border and had access to American weapons. The first stage of the revolution essentially ended when the Maderistas beat the regime forces of Porfirio Diaz in May 1911 at the Battle of Ciudad Juarez, a skirmish that Americans gathered to watch from the safety of the American side of the border. The Mexican Revolution, however, had only begun, and the border became a key battleground, not just for future battles, but one where geopolitics took an increasing importance. Several Mexican revolutionary factions, for example, began attacking American positions and property, some with the insane idea of trying to goad the U.S. to enter the war against the other side, and others for more mundane reasons like revenge. The most famous was Pancho Villa's March 9, 1916 raid on Columbus, New Mexico. On that day, Villa's forces burned half the town and killed 8 American soldiers, part of a military garrison there. In response, the United States sent a 10,000-strong punitive expedition led by John Pershing, a future World War I general. The large number of troops ended up being pretty useless, however, as Villa melted into the mountains, an area he knew exceptionally well. Other than the Columbus raid, there were multiple other mutual attacks along the border, including the assassination in 1915 of another Mexican revolutionary, Pascual Orozco, and several lynchings well into the 1920s. There was also the Battle of both Nogales on August 27, 1918, when confusion over a border crosser inadvertently led to a shootout between U.S. and Mexican forces that ended with dozens of soldiers killed and hundreds of civilian casualties, including the mayor of Nogales, Mexico. In the end, this led to the building of a 2-mile wall between the two towns, one of the first man-made physical separations between the two countries. The end of the Mexican Revolution did not end the American anxiety about controlling the flow of people and goods along the border. And in 1924, the first limits on migration from the Western Hemisphere were instituted, as well as the creation of the Border Patrol. This was especially so because the arrival of Prohibition made Mexican border towns attractive destinations for those looking to drink. Pretty soon, the region became notorious for its bars, like this one in Tijuana, which advertised itself as the largest bar in the world. This became enough of a problem that at different points, the American government ordered border checkpoints closed early so that Americans would not be able to attempt a return while heavily drunk. Along with this, smuggling of alcohol also became an issue, so the Border Patrol continued to grow. In 1924, it had only a few hundred men that covered the entirety of the US-Mexico border. It soon doubled and then continued even after the end of Prohibition. By the late 1930s, it was around 750, and by the early 1940s, it had over 1,500. But this was only the beginning. In 1933, the Border Patrol was made part of the Immigration and Naturalization Service, and in June 1954, the INS, looking to show off its effectiveness, decided to carry out the largest deportation effort in American history, the official name of which was Operation Wetback. Using military-style tactics, the operation ended up deporting over 1 million people, an unknown number of whom were American citizens. This was not the first time Mexican Americans were illegally repatriated. A similar effort had occurred in the 1930s, but this time it was much larger and the conditions were worse. As a result of the operation, 88 of those deported died of heat stroke. The post-war economic success in both Mexico and the United States and the end of Prohibition calmed down Americans' anxiety about the border somewhat, as illegal crossings tumbled and the government had not yet decided to regulate other types of drugs. The 1970s war on drugs and repeated Mexican economic crisis changed all of that. Panic became such that the U.S. Supreme Court explicitly decided in a number of cases in the 1970s that Mexican appearance was perfectly legal as a reason to stop cars at permanent border checkpoints. Meanwhile, the 1980s crack epidemic and the subsequent crackdown on Colombian cartel routes through Miami shifted both the supply lines and the attention to the U.S.-Mexican border. Finally, the 1994 North American Free Trade Agreement ended up changing the nature of the border once again, as millions of jobs were created, as American parts and know-how took advantage of access to cheap labor on the Mexican side. This meant that the assembling of parts for appliances, textiles, and other products crossed the border multiple times before ending up in a finished product. This brought prosperity to both sides, and also a huge opportunity for smuggling. Every day, millions of goods come across to meet American demand, but not all are supposed to. One additional development ensured angst would grow about the border. This was Proposition 187, a ballot initiative that Californians passed on November 8, 1994. The proposed law was meant to deny any kind of government benefit to people without the proper immigration status, but it was soon challenged in the courts and declared unconstitutional. This enraged conservatives who, with their new majority in Congress, immediately set out to be tough on illegal immigration. One way to do this was to expand the Border Patrol and drown it in resources. This began a long period of increased spending, which would grow even more after the terrorist attacks of 9/11. It was around this time that the border began its more dramatic physical transformation with walls and barriers. By September 2001, all major urban areas had them, but then in 2006, Congress passed the Secured Fence Act, which intended to expand it all along the border. That was easy in theory, but hard in practice for two reasons. First, there were massive natural barriers, not just in places like Big Bend National Park, which you see here, but also because all along the Rio Grande there is marshland, which is not conducive to building massive walls or fences, and so they would have to be built several meters away from riverbanks, in effect reducing American territory. The second was that given the history of the eastern part of the border, there were large parts of the Rio Grande that were private property. These were not just ranches and houses, but golf courses, churches, and even a casino near Eagle Pass. Not surprisingly, their owners were not keen on giving up part of their land to build physical barriers. For the most part, lawsuits stopped much of the construction. On the western part, meanwhile, there was land owned by the Tohono O'odham, an indigenous tribe that was divided into two by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and whose members retained access to the United States even when born on the Mexican side. At least that was the arrangement until D.C. decided to build a wall to separate the land. Thus, the 2006 bill ended up creating barriers just about everywhere it could, pushing would-be irregular border crossers to go into more and more inhospitable and dangerous territory, particularly the Arizona desert, where thousands of people have died trying to cross since the 1990s. Neither the obvious obstacles nor the deaths stopped Trump from championing a new wall, nor from it becoming a serious policy debate. Serious only in the sense that it became a given among the Trump faithful, while everyone else found the focus on it to be counterproductive. This was especially so because from the mid-2010s to the present, the main immigration issue at the border has not been irregular crossers, but asylum seekers, especially from the Northern Triangle in Central America, who deliberately turn themselves into border authorities and therefore individuals who a wall would not stop. In the end, Trump managed to deal with this, not with a wall, but with a simple directive to have people that wanted asylum to wait on the Mexican side of the border. This created numerous camps on the Mexican side in horrible conditions, but making it to the other side wasn't necessarily better, as even occasionally before Trump, but especially once he became president, the separation of families became standard government policy. In the meantime, there were significant developments related to drug trafficking along the U.S.-Mexico border. Once dominated by a single Guadalajara cartel, policing efforts and internal divisions divided the cartel into multiple competing organizations based around single regions within the border: the Tijuana cartel, the Juarez cartel, and the Gulf cartel. Competition between them made Tijuana and Juarez in particular the most dangerous cities in the Western Hemisphere for a while, in the 2000s, especially for women whose disproportionate homicide rate in Juarez became a cause célèbre during this period. The 2010s brought some peace, but the cartels have continued to fracture, and as new organizations have surfaced, like the Jalisco Cartel New Generation, violence has returned to the border with a vengeance. Some have even taken on the migrant smuggling business for themselves. All the while, the cartels continue to find new ways to smuggle drugs: tunnels, drones, submarines, fake products. The business continues to be immensely profitable as they try to meet the insatiable American demand for drugs. Thus, today, the U.S.-Mexico border remains what it has always been: a place of opportunity for some, a headache and source of anxiety for others, an unfolding tragedy for some of its inhabitants, and a place of hope for others. The details differ over time, but the spirit of the borderlands remains the same, a challenge that neither country can afford to ignore.